Hello, everyone, and welcome to History and Gaming Alexandria. This is Mike, your host, and today we're talking about the American Civil War in the West. We're going to review a few books and discuss wargaming the American Civil War west of the Mississippi in the Indian Territories, in the Confederate invasion of Arizona and New Mexico, and we'll talk about a few interesting, very excellent 28 millimeter figures from Raven Banner Games. They're Confederate sharpshooters. I won't tell you who these figures remind me of. I think I'll just let Clint Eastwood do the talking and roll tape.
Do you really think you can shoot all those men down before they shoot you? Oh, no, Mr. Josie Wales. There is such a thing in this country called justice.
Well, Mr. Carpetbagger, we got something in this territory called the Missouri Boat Ride.
And yes, so Josie Wales, Clint Eastwood sends a troop of Union cavalry on a Missouri boat ride. So that's one thing these figures might be able to do, but take a look at the 28 millimeter Confederate sharpshooters from Raven Banner Games. You get about five of them, and there's an interesting set of poses. There's one figure you could see with a loose rifle raising his hat up on what looks like a stick, or it could be a bayonet, in order to try to fool the enemy. You also have one that's seated that I assume could be posed or glued into a tree or onto a fence as you wish. And there's an officer who I've based and painted with a few other sharpshooters as well, and they're dressed in a variety of uniform and semi-uniform kit. So you have the round hats, you have the campaign hat or forage cap, and they're pretty representative of the type of sharpshooter skirmisher figures that you would see, particularly out in the West and then in other theaters as well. And interestingly, they all have the scope, very similar to what you see in that Outlaw Josie Wales clip. And you could paint that. In my case, I painted it silver, but you may want to try gold or bronze and whatever you think works. But I think they're very interesting figures. I haven't seen sharpshooters too often for the rebel side. You do have Berdan's rifles, which was a northern sharpshooter unit that was raised during the war. And of course, there were Union sharpshooters, and they're represented as well. But it's unusual to find, I think, Confederate sharpshooters. This is probably one of the few sets that I've ever seen, and Raven Banner Games does a pretty good job with them, as I think you'd agree. We also have them painted up alongside some mounted cavalry command figures from their American Civil War range, and these I've also based and painted to use in Wild West games and other American Civil War skirmishes. So as you can see, they make a horse holder figure for dismounted cavalry or as a deployment point or vignette or scene, who's very nice. And for that, as part of that set, you would get two horse holder figures and three horses. And also they have mounted cavalry, both Confederate and Union, and I think you'll agree that they paint up really nicely. They also have some specific figures for the Western theater. They have Lang's Lancers, a Confederate lance cavalry that was short lived from Texas and took part in the Battle of Valverde. So they do make a 28 millimeter range of those figures, which are interesting. But more on that soon, because now we'll talk a little bit about just what were the Confederates and the Federal Army doing out west, west of Texas and Arizona and the Indian Territories. What was the goal? What were they actually fighting over out there? How far west did they get? And who were the key commanders involved? What were the key engagements involved? And I think we'll start off with just how far west they got. We'll take a look at the story of the skirmish at Picacho Pass, which is often called the furthest westernmost battle of the American Civil War. In reality, more of a skirmish than a battle. It took place northwest of Tucson, Arizona, where the Confederates had occupied the city. And this was in around March of 1862, when a Confederate Ranger commander, Captain Sherrod Hunter, had occupied Tucson, and part of his forces pushed out west to push the westernmost boundaries of Confederate Arizona, ultimately aspiring to move into California at some point. The Union, of course, objected to that, and a Lieutenant James Barrett of the 1st California Cavalry was also moving out towards Tucson, and his cavalry split into different groups. He decided not to await reinforcements and took on the Texas Rangers at Picacho Pass. It's a small skirmish, but you could see the rough terrain. You could see the battlefield as it exists today, with the landmark as well. Barrett essentially rode into the Rangers' camp, attacking with only a small retinue of troops. This again is about 50 miles northwest of Tucson, located on the overland stagecoach route at the time. Barrett himself was killed, and there was a fierce skirmish that continued for over an hour before the Texas Rangers had to fall back to Tucson. Barrett's men, out in very harsh country without their leader, had to rejoin other Californians and regroup. Hunter's Rangers did successfully delay this column, prevented in doing so a surprise attack on Tucson, and as it often went in the West, small numbers of troops operating far away from their main bases of supply. It made the margin of error very narrow. It made the difference between victory and defeat on the battlefield, in a strategic sense and an operational sense, a lot more contingent on your supplies and logistics and your ability to sustain troops in the open in some very harsh countryside, um, which really outweighed, in many cases, tactical edges on the battlefield. And we'll see that in the battles of Valverde and Glorieta Pass as we talk about those as well. So, this westernmost battle of the Civil War is a bit of a representative example of how these types of actions went in some very harsh, very sparsely populated countryside. In this case, Pacheco Pass was located in the Pima Indian Territory. So to sum up on Picacho Pass, it is considered the westernmost battle of the American Civil War, but it was preceded on March 20, 1862, at Stanwix Station, which is related, in which a forward operating force of the California Column, which was under a commander named Carleton. That would be Colonel James Carleton, initially colonel, but promoted to brigadier en route from Fort Yuma to Tucson during the campaign. He would also go on to fight the Apache numerous times, including the large battle between the U.S. federal forces and the Apache at Apache Springs. But for now, he was in charge of the California Column, moving out from Fort Yuma towards Confederate Arizona and Tucson. And most of these skirmishes and battles in the West, they occurred over semi-abandoned, essentially overland routes and trail routes, which were very much related to a search for supplies and an attempt to deny supply and storage stations to the enemy in the New Mexico territory. So Stanwix Station, small skirmish in which a small number of Confederates were driven off after a brief exchange of gunfire by forward elements of Colonel Carleton's column from California, was shortly after that followed up by the clash at Picacho Pass, in which, as we noted, James Barrett was killed, I believe, shot in the neck while trying to secure a few Confederate prisoners that he initially managed to to seize, including, I believe, Sergeant Henry Holmes, who was in charge of the Confederate cavalry. And Picacho Pass, when we say battle, again, we're talking about approximately 13 or 14 Union cavalrymen against about a dozen, maybe 10 Confederates. And then we can talk about how to wargame these types of actions. Again, the nature of the troops involved, the nature of the tactics involved are dictated by the battles along the overland route in a sparsely populated, very harsh, almost a desert part of the country where it's difficult to support large armies in the field. There isn't enough food, there aren't enough supplies. Even when they came across supply stations, they had been raided by Apache tribes or otherwise, you know, destroyed by the enemy. And so you can see the terrain, you can see these stunning images. The mountain, essentially the peak at Picacho Pass, is a sort of plugged volcano. There's a lot of very interesting terrain that you could put together to really make a compelling table, perhaps with an abandoned mine or a mining town or a stop along the overland route. It's very different from the type of larger pitched battles that players typically game when they think about the American Civil War. But moving on to other topics and a few of our books, we'll take a closer look at some of the bigger battles and the bigger picture in the West during this period. And on that point, we're going to review a few excellent books on the subject of the Civil War in the West. We'll talk about the most recent book that I've seen. This is The Three-Cornered War by Megan Kate Nelson, The Union, the Confederacy, and Nations in the West, a biography of Henry Hopkins Sibley, the main Confederate commander in the Western theater, certainly in Arizona and New Mexico anyway. Another Confederate commander was a Native American Cherokee, Stanwix, and General Stanwix's Confederate Indians by Frank Cunningham will be a book that we review. There is the Civil War in the Western Territories, breaking it down into Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah by Ray Clayton. The Civil War in the Indian Territory by Steve Cottrell, focusing on the Indian Territory proper and not the Sibley expedition. And of course, the Battle of Glorieta Pass, a Gettysburg in the West, which focuses in great detail on the key Battle of Glorieta Pass in New Mexico. And so our first book, The Civil War in the Western Territories by Ray C. Colton, I think covers this overview fairly well. It is a political and a general history of the situation in the West overall on the eve of the Civil War and during the Civil War. It does cover some of the battles. So from a wargaming perspective, you do have a chapter on Glorieta Pass. It describes the Confederate retreat from Glorieta, the situation involving campaigns against the American Indians, primarily by the federal government here. And it does cover the initial Confederate invasion of the West as well. It does not go into great detail of the battles, although it does contain some exciting descriptions of individual actions, like Picacho Pass, for instance, and elements of Glorieta Pass. It does have a map of that battle. The book is, despite being somewhat dated, the maps are not bad and they are easy to follow. And it does cover key battles such as Valverde, but not in as great a detail as some other sources that focus on them. And I think that's just a nature of the scope of the book. But overall, if you're interested in the history of this period and in what the conflict was about, it is not a bad place to start. And one important aspect of the Civil War in the West is looking at it in three distinct phases and theaters. We have, on the one hand, the initial Confederate invasion of Arizona and New Mexico involving the Army of New Mexico. This was led, as we'll discuss, by John Baylor and later mainly Henry Hopkins Sibley. And this was a formal Confederate army that moved out from Texas into what became Confederate Arizona with this concept of a Confederate manifest destiny, attempting to seize valuable mining operations, move through the Western territories that had been captured by Mexico during the Mexican-American War, and then eventually reach California. On top of that, and related to that campaign, we have the very necessary Confederate conflict with the various Apache tribes, the Chickasaw, led by individuals like Mangas Coloradas and Cochise, as well as the Mescalero Apaches, who had been fighting a war with the Spanish Empire dating back to the days of um, Bernardo Galvez, and later on, although that calmed down to some extent after the Spanish Empire constructed various fortresses or presidios throughout the Apacheria territory and Sonora territory in Mexico and what became Arizona as well. And so the Confederates, as well as the Union and the Californians, were all involved with protecting their territories, their troops, and the civilians and miners under their control from the Apache. In addition to that campaign, so we have the Confederate invasion of New Mexico by Henry Hopkins Sibley from Texas with the objective of seizing Union forts and pushing on to the Pacific. We also have this sort of organic conflict brewing with the Apache, as well as later as well as the Comanche tribes in that area. We have the local Hispanic population involved as well. And separate from that theater, we have the Civil War in the American Indian Territories, which is northeast in what's today Oklahoma. And those territories involved American Indians and Native American tribes that had been displaced following the Trail of Tears and relocation, involving mainly the Cherokee, the Choctaw, and other American Indian tribes from Mississippi, Georgia, Florida, and those areas. They had been resettled in Oklahoma, what was called Indian Territory, and that involved a separate conflict in which you had more organized Confederate allied and federal allied Native American forces fighting alongside the Union and Confederate armies in conflicts that took place in Indian Territory among factions of the Cherokee and Choctaw, and also spilled into Missouri and Kansas as well. So in many ways, we have this layered conflict that incorporates grievances left over from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the defeat of Mexico by the United States, and all of the Indian tribal Native American conflicts that the United States effectively inherited from Mexico and the Spanish Empire before that, which were layered onto the conflict between North and South during the Civil War. And our next book, which is certainly not dated, it's very recent, The Three-Cornered War, The Union, the Confederacy, and Native Peoples in the Fight for the West by Megan Kate Nelson, is a very interesting book. It's a narrative story about the conflict in the West seen through the eyes of various historical personalities, ranging from Kit Carson, who raised a unit of Coloradans and fought at the Battle of Valverde on the federal side, to John Baylor, who is an important figure who essentially launched the Confederate project in the West, as well as Mangas Coloradas, a relative of Cochise and an Apache leader, and as well as other soldiers and civilians in the region. So it's written in a very engaging fashion. In terms of the battles, there is a chapter on Valverde and a chapter on Glorieta Pass, probably about 20 pages or so overall. So it's not written as a tactical history of the battles in any sense, but there are definitely interesting pieces of information in here. There are detailed descriptions of just how the Coloradan units stood off, the charge of Texas Lance Cavalry and formed square. That doesn't necessarily appear in other sources. So this is a very interesting book, and it's well written, And as a supplement to reading more specific books about the battles themselves and the military history, I think it's an excellent read. So, one aspect of the Three Cornered War that is really fantastic is the way it follows the lives of individual characters. As noted, Louisa Canby, the wife of a senior U.S. Army officer, and very interestingly and pertinent for us, John Robert Baylor, who was an adventurer, a one-time Indian agent, and primarily a rancher and Confederate Army officer, who really launched the entire Confederate project in Arizona and the West. When Texas seceded from the Union around February of 1861, and the Civil War started in earnest 2 months after that, uh, Baylor essentially began leading an expedition along the Rio Grande out of Texas, trying to push into New Mexico with this idea of a Confederate manifest destiny. And a bit more on John R. Baylor. He was a very colorful character, by all accounts, a huge guy, very strong, combative. He was a one-time, Indian fighter. He had joined a militia of Rangers who fought the Comanche in Texas. On that note, he also got into a dispute with Sam Houston, was very, prominent in the independence of Texas from Mexico, and also a staunch Unionist. His dispute with Houston over support for settlers in their conflict with the Comanche and other tribes. And during one fight, he seized some silver hair clasps off of Comanche that he'd killed and had them melted down and remade into a belt buckle that was stamped with the Lone Star of Texas. And he often wore that into battle as well. So interesting character. And so, around the same time that the Confederate President Jefferson Davis is allowing another officer, Henry Hopkins Sibley, permission to raise troops in Texas, you have Baylor basically taking off with an army from San Antonio and moving into the New Mexico area, following the Rio Grande and starting off around Fort Bliss and coming into contact with the Union under Isaac Lind, a Union officer at Fort Fillmore. And Fort Fillmore becomes a key engagement for Baylor and his men. He basically cooks up this plan to boldly seize the fort using elements of surprise and tactical ingenuity. Unfortunately, as he approaches the fort at night with the idea to appear, out of the mountains as the sun rises, he hears the bugles playing and he realizes that the Union troops in Fort Fillmore are wise to his plan. And it turns out that a deserter from his ranks had slipped away and warned the Federals. And so the Second Texas cavalry under his command had lost the advantage of surprise. And at that point, he makes a key decision. He abandons his original plan and orders his men to march backwards toward a trading town called Mesilla. And Mesilla is easily occupied by the Confederates under Baylor, and he sets about the political task of basically courting the local secessionist population, which is easy to do, and proclaims Mesilla the capital of Confederate Arizona. And in doing this, um, he obviously attracts the ire of Isaac Lind and his forces. And before you know it, Lind and some of the Federal Army from Fort Fillmore appear outside of Mesilla, and they essentially demand his surrender. Now, Mesilla is, despite being a small trading town, it was the gateway to the region's silver and gold and copper mines, which was really significant. And so, as Baylor rides into Mesilla and takes the town, which is fairly pro-Confederate to begin with, it turns out that when he occupies Mesilla on July 25th of 1861, he becomes the first Confederate to lead a successful invasion of the Union territory. However, you have the troops from Fort Fillmore under Isaac Lind moving in, and Baylor surveys the scene and he sets up a defensive position. So he orders the majority of the Second Texas to dismount, move on foot to the southern edge of the town. He places some of his troops along the road and others on the flat roofs of the surrounding adobe buildings, homes, and other structures, and the rest of his men take up position in corrals and various cornfields, and they wait for the Union to arrive. And you could almost imagine setting the scene on a tabletop, trying to depict this battle, trying to represent what Baylor and Lind were trying to accomplish here. And according to the account provided by Megan Nelson in her book, The Three-Cornered War, as Isaac Lind sends his men up, he carries a flag of truce and attempts to parley, and it instructs Baylor to surrender. Baylor replies that if Lind wants the town, he has to come and take it, and that the Confederates will fight first and surrender afterward. Of course, he knows that they're outnumbered, but he counts on having a superior defensive position. Now, here is where Lind makes a series of key blunders that ultimately end in his surrender to Baylor and his being essentially expelled from the Union Army. Now, Lind opens up some artillery fire on the rebels. According to the Three-Cornered War, Lind's couriers disappeared down the road. Within a matter of minutes, two cannon shots hurtled towards Baylor's line. One exploded on the roof of a building, and the other struck a tree, sending limbs and shards of bark flying. Then the Texans turned to see a regiment of Union cavalry pounding down the road toward them. And then he mounts a cavalry charge. Now Baylor has his men wait until the Federals are in range of their relatively short range weapons. A lot of the Arizona Guards, Arizona militia, and the Confederate troops in the West were armed with shotguns and pistols. Some captured Springfields, which which they had an opportunity to get their hands on, but mainly short range weapons. So they lie in wait and they open fire and disperse the Union cavalry charge. And at this point, the Union under Lind, they decide to fall back to Fort Fillmore. And Baylor considers his situation, and he goes out to the fort to inspect what's going on later on, and he finds out that Lind has essentially abandoned Fort Fillmore at that point. Baylor at this point sends up his artillery, which had been located at Fort Bliss, and marches on Fort Fillmore, attempting to use the artillery to pound it into submission from high sandy hills and crests located between the fort and the Rio Grande. You'll note that as we talk about Valverde, this theme of attempting to occupy high ground around the Rio Grande in order to, pound and pummel fortifications in the West is a theme with Fort Craig in the lead up to the Battle of Valverde as well. But for now, Baylor, as he attempts to do this, he discovers that Fort Fillmore has essentially been abandoned. Now, Isaac Lind completely botches the idea of retreating from Fort Fillmore across the open desert and trying to reach other Union forces and essentially giving up on Mesilla. He totally mismanages the logistics of this. The men do not have enough water. In some cases, canteens are filled with alcohol or whiskey, and so by the time Baylor's Confederates catch up to them at a place called San Agustin Springs, Lind and his men are totally exhausted, struggling with thirst, and they readily surrender to the Confederates. You have John Baylor, adventurer, Indian fighter, making these bold maneuvers and essentially coming up against a Union officer that is not up to speed on how to fight in this environment, and is easily beaten at the end of the day. And of course, Baylor and the Confederates are full of confidence as a result of this. And as Megan Nelson writes, the vast mineral resources of Arizona, in addition to its affording an outlet to the Pacific, make its acquisition a matter of importance to the Confederate government. There is no question that Arizona Territory was essential to the Confederacy's plans to reach California, and John Baylor had just cleared the way. He was the vanguard of the Confederate manifest destiny. And on that note, our next book is Confederate General of the West, which is an excellent biography by Jerry Thompson, biography of Henry Hopkins Sibley, the commander of the Sibley Brigade and the Confederate Army of New Mexico. Sibley was from Louisiana. He was a Southerner, although his wife was from New York. He was a mediocre commander who went to West Point. He had a background fighting with Zachary Taylor in the Seminole Wars, later transferred out west, where he fought in the Utah War, the Mormon War, where between the Federal Army and the Mormons, as well as against the Navajo and other American Indian tribes, where he fought alongside General Edward Canby, who becomes very important in our story because he becomes the chief adversary of Sibley in Arizona, or at least in the initial invasion of the New Mexico territory around the Battle of Fort Craig and Valverde. So, for historical reference here, we have the secession of Texas in February 1st of 1861. Subsequently, we have John Baylor moving out from San Antonio and participating in the actions against Fort Fillmore, culminating in the First Battle of Mesilla in July of 1861, July 25th of 1861. And then we have Henry Hopkins Sibley enter the scene. Now, his first major battle, Valverde, which takes place in the vicinity of Fort Craig, which was commanded by his former comrade in arms, Edward Canby, takes place in February of 1862. So, to give you an idea, we have an entire year almost from the time Texas secedes to the time that Sibley is able to get forces together and move westward. Now, Sibley is an interesting character. He certainly has grandiose dreams. This is certainly the way that Jerry Thompson's book portrays him. He also has significant health problems centering around his alcohol abuse. That is due to various stomach and digestive problems that he had over the years. But regardless, his abuse of alcohol interferes with his ability to stay focused and command and be present for obvious reasons. And he does have these grandiose dreams of selling this idea to Jefferson Davis that based upon his experience serving out in the Western territories, that the Federal Army was not able to staff and to defend its forts effectively, that it was spread out, that there weren't really federal resources to defend the Western territories, and it would be easy for the Confederate Army, led by him, conveniently, to move out west with forces to live off the fortresses, the resources that they were able to capture from the various federal installations, and essentially seize valuable gold, silver, and copper mines, take Colorado, take New Mexico, and move into California. And even his ambition didn't stop there. There was some ambition to either invade or purchase or negotiate Confederate acquisition of Mexican states such as Sonora, Baja California, Lower California, and others, Chihuahua, for instance. So this was a very ambitious operation. It quickly becomes clear that Sibley does not have the resources to accomplish this. Although he sees Baylor go out and move out from Fort Bliss and attack Lind and occupy Fort Fillmore with fairly minimal effort, it takes him quite a bit of time to gather forces and to gather resources in Texas, even before he's able to move out beyond the Confederate borders. Of course, there are also difficulties with paying for things. The Mexicans and other locals do not want to accept Confederate money. Unlike the United States, the Confederate States did not have credit in the way that the US government did. So there's all sorts of problems with purchasing things, having to trade for items, and other difficulties that. And I'll read a quote from Sibley's proclamation at Fort Bliss, New Mexico in 1861. This is December of 1861, when he finally does make it across. He states, "An army under my command enters New Mexico to take possession of it in the name and for the benefit of the Confederate States by geographical position, similarity of institutions, commercial interests, and by future destinies, New Mexico pertains to the Confederacy. Now, about a year later, in May of 1862, he writes to an associate at Fort Bliss in Texas, except for its political geographic position, the territory of New Mexico is not worth a quarter of the blood and treasure expended in its conquest. So what happened? What was this change of heart on the part of Henry Hopkins Sibley? Well, we'll discuss this and talk about the key Battle of Valverde in this part one of our episode on the Civil War in the West. Now, as I've noted, Sibley is a fairly mediocre officer based on the account of his activities in Utah during the Mormon War, in the conflict with the American Indians that he was involved in, as well as his role in the Seminole Wars. He was not without creativity. He did design a Sibley tent, which was a sort of self-heating tent system that the Army used for many years, even into the early 20th century. And so he was certainly, to some extent, a dreamer. He did have certain qualities, but his problems often outweighed them and got him into trouble, as we'll see. But for the beginning, he was able to eventually recruit a force and move into the New Mexico territory, although it did take some time, involving his working with Earl Van Dorn in Texas and dealing with the bureaucracy and other difficulties in getting equipment and men for this expedition from the Confederate States and from the local militias in that area. In any regards, he does move across the border, and he comes into the vicinity of Fort Craig, which is the first major U.S. installation that he has to deal with. And as noted, it's commanded by Edward Canby, whose wife Louisa Canby is a major subject of the Three-Cornered War that we discussed earlier. And she ultimately, as Sibley eventually advances further north, she gets stuck behind in Santa Fe and ends up, nursing Confederate soldiers and other wounded, in a very generous fashion. And Sibley is particularly incensed and goes back and forth with Earl Van Dorn and other commanders in Texas who prioritize the coastal defenses along the Gulf of Mexico, sending heavier artillery and more modern weapons to those areas before the Sibley Brigade can really benefit from any of these more modern arms. And so the brigade is often outfitted and equipped with weapons they bring from home, or shotguns, or more antiquated weapons, all of which adds up to the fact that they don't have enough heavy artillery to really take on a fortified Union position, such as Fort Craig, among others. And significantly, most of their weapons are short range shotguns and other antiquated rifles, which means they don't really have the ability to fight the Union troops at range. They have to come into close contact in order to be effective, and this really affects their ability going forward. It also necessitates that they take the offensive almost at all times in order to capture Union supplies and Union cities and towns and positions, and is try to live off the land and live off the territory as much as possible in a place like New Mexico, which is extremely harsh and barren. And so you can see all of the real world logistical difficulties that are even now, that are even at an early stage, are interfering with Henry Hopkins Sibley's lofty ambitions in this area. And so as Henry Hopkins Sibley and the Sibley Brigade approach Fort Craig, and I'll show you a map that I drew representing this action, so that it's important to understand the initial approach to Fort Craig and Sibley's change in his plan based upon Canby's reaction in order to understand what happened at Valverde. Sibley first has the idea to force Canby out of the fortress and into some sort of open battle, and thereby uses artillery and whatever other perceived advantages he thought he had in order to gain victory. However, as he approaches the fort, he quickly becomes apparent that the Confederate artillery is not not strong enough to actually penetrate the walls or do anything to the fort, that Canby has gone about his business professionally and organized his troops and has no intention of coming out. He also, Canby is fully aware that he has, although he has about 2 to 3 thousand men, the majority of them are volunteers and New Mexican volunteers, and also men recruited from the local Hispanic population who don't necessarily have combat experience as soldiers. So he doesn't have many regular army personnel. He has some cavalry and artillery, but he's not confident in the ability of these troops to go out and fight in the open and to stand their ground or win a victory. And so, as Sibley approaches the initial battle line, which is the pink dotted line, you can see the yellow arrow coming up along the black road, which borders the Rio Grande. And so Sibley initially advances on February the 16th to that pink battle line where he attempts to draw Canby out of Fort Craig. Canby does not take the bait. He's not confident that his troops can win a battle out in the open, given many of them are volunteers with minimal training and militia. And so Sibley at this point decides he has a number of options, none of them particularly good, but he decides to recross the Rio Grande near the village of Paraje, which you could see on the map that I drew, and you could see the yellow dotted lines where the Confederates they cross the Rio Grande over the mesa through some difficult terrain. It takes them a while. They reach and set up a camp on February the 20th. That's the represented by the box with the black box with the tents in it as Sibley's camp. Subsequently, they send forces north. They send forces up the map towards the Rio Grande and the Mesa de la Contadera to attempt to install artillery there and outflank Fort Craig from that direction, or essentially to force Canby out of Fort Craig. Canby does send New Mexico volunteers and some other forces out across the river as well, which we'll talk about, and it's in that vicinity of Valverde where they've forded the river that the Battle of Valverde occurs. Now, Jerry Thompson describes the terrain in this area as follows. He states, with supplies running short, a crucial decision had to be made. A council of war was called during which it was decided to bypass the fort and recross the river at a small ford named Valverde, some 6 miles upriver from the fort. In bypassing Fort Craig, Sibley was presented with a problem of having to traverse miles of unsuitable terrain. The valley of the Rio Grande is bounded on the east by a basaltic mesa which rises from 40 to 80 feet above the river. The Pedregal is intersected by ridges of drifting sand and broken in places by protruding beds of lava. The mesa was accessible from Fort Craig in several places by bridle paths, and in one place by a road suitable for artillery. Opposite Fort Craig, the Pedregal projects into the valley, forming a small mesa, which from a distance of 1,000 yards overlooked the fort. This presented more of a problem to Canby than to Sibley, and 2.5 miles above the fort, the Mesa del Contadero, or Black Mesa, as it was commonly called, rises to a height of 300 feet. This mesa, the most distinctive landmark in the area, is about 3 miles long east and west and 2 miles in width, north and south, and protrudes several hundred yards into the valley. Sibley admitted his decision to bypass Fort Craig was obviously a risky one. And I think he noted that had Canby been bold enough to unleash his cavalry, or at least his regular troops, while the Confederates were crossing the river, he could have quite possibly put an end to the Sibley Brigade and much of its equipment before any of this really got off the ground. But he didn't. He played his cards conservatively, and Sibley eventually got his men around to the Valverde area. Now, it's in the lead up to the Battle of Valverde when Canby sends out some of his skirmishers and artillery to feel out where Sibley's camp is at night, that one of the more interesting events of this campaign, and indeed of the Civil War, occurs. And so Canby sends out skirmishers to feel out the Confederate position, and this maneuver draws fire from rebel artillery, which essentially causes the Federals to panic. And as night falls, as Jerry Thompson explains, during that night, one of the most mirthful, as he calls it, incidents of the entire Civil War occurred. Apparently, there's a Union spy or an agent named Captain Paddy Graydon from Ireland, and he had recruited a spy company of volunteers upriver from Fort Craig and attempted to make a surprise raid on the rebel camp. But this was no ordinary raid, because the daring Graydon had his men fill two wooden boxes with 24-pound howitzer shells, complete with fuses, and they attached the boxes to the back of two old mules. Now, Graydon, with about four of his men, they wade the icy waters of the Rio Grande at night and approached to within a short distance of Sibley's camp. Now, if you reference the map that I drew, that I created, you can see the Mesa de la Contadera, the Rio Grande, and you could trace essentially the area where they would have crossed and tried to make their way near Sibley's camp, which is represented by the square in the center of the map. Now, Graydon assumed that the Union mules would make friends with some of the Confederate mules, which he'd seen accompanying the rebel column, and so they ignited the fuses, attached them to the mules, and they were started at a gallop toward the sleeping Sibley Brigade's camp. Now, Graydon and his men then took off at top speed toward the river and Fort Craig in order to escape, but the mules had other ideas, and instead of going toward the rebel camp, they headed back to the fort, following the men who'd brought them there. And so Graydon and his men ran at top speed back toward the fort with the mules following them, chasing them basically. And in the silence of the night, the howitzer shells exploded, no doubt blowing up the mules in the middle of the desert at night and alerting the Confederates, but not exactly achieving the mission that Graydon and his agents had set out for. So that's certainly an interesting aside here. Definitely an interesting skirmish game scenario, complete with exploding mules. If you have the figures and the desire to create that one or to work it into one of your games, certainly an interesting. And so, as the Battle of Valverde gets underway, we can talk about Henry Sibley's subordinates a bit and the order of battle. Sibley is intoxicated and sick for most of this battle. He does not even show up at the battlefield. He's basically out of the picture for at least a day before Valverde starts. And so during the day, command passes to Tom Green, one of his subordinates. Now, Tom Green is a lawyer before the war. He's clerk of the Texas Supreme Court. He does have experience fighting in the Texas War of Independence under Sam Houston. He also has some success early in the war in Louisiana and distinguishes himself at Valverde and also at Glorieta Pass, among other actions during the war. Now, Major Pyron is the first to encounter the Union at Valverde. Significantly, there is also William Reed Scurry, or Dirty Shirt Scurry, heck of a nickname. He, like Green, he's also a lawyer before the war and a district attorney. He has experience fighting as a private in the Mexican-American War, eventually rising to the rank of major by 1846. And he is a significant commander at Valverde, as well as later on in the campaign in Glorieta Pass, as Sibley is increasingly simply not healthy enough or sober enough to participate in these battles. On the Battle of Valverde, I'll be talking about it generally and giving you more food for thought for wargaming ideas, but for a real play-by-play breakdown of the battle itself, aside from Confederate General of the West by Jerry Thompson or the Three-Cornered War, by Megan Nelson that we discussed, you should check out the American Battlefield War. I'm sorry, that's the American Battlefield Trust website. Barry Edelman also does a very interesting video available on YouTube from the vicinity of Fort Craig, which you should check out as well. I won't be giving a full play-by-play of the battle here, but suffice it to say that Sibley is out of the picture. You do have this initial clash of the forces, which the Union really by the early afternoon appear to have the better of the Confederates. You do have this daring charge by an officer named Willis Lang of the Texas Lance Cavalry. There are two units of Texas Lance Cavalry, and apparently Lang, in consultation with Greene and I believe Scurry, notice a number of Union troops dressed in gray, who they assume to be New Mexican militia. That's inexperienced, but which is actually a unit of Coloradans under Captain Dodd, and they attempt to charge them and scatter them using Lang's lance cavalry, and it ends disastrously, with most of the lance cavalry being decimated as Dodd orders his men to calmly, form square and open fire at the Confederates at the appropriate range, and the lance cavalry's charge ends in disaster. It does, however, have the effect of drawing the Union forces somewhat out of position and forward, and as Canby arrives at the battlefield by the afternoon, he starts to make adjustments to the Union line, where he attempts to essentially remove troops from his center, particularly using some of Kit Carson's New Mexican troops to attempt to outflank the rebels and move off to his own right flank and sort of pivot off of that to envelop the rebel line. This does not end well. It's not well executed, and it opens up a section of the federal center to attack, which at this point Greene and Scurry take advantage of, and the rebels pour into essentially charge this weakly defended area around McRae's battery, which is the federal artillery, and manage to overrun it. Now, as they overrun the guns, the federal troops fall back. There are less infantry defending these guns. McRae is killed in battle, refusing to give up his guns. There's an interesting story, which is recounted in Confederate General of the West, about one of the artillerymen essentially opening up fire with his revolver at some of the ammunition cases and blowing them up and blowing himself up in the process in an attempt to deny the artillery to the onrushing Texans. Nonetheless, the Federals are largely driven across the river, and the Confederate Army, the Texans, seize the guns at Valverde, which become these prize cannons that they use throughout the campaign, the Valverde guns, and even make it back to Texas after the campaign. And at that point, Canby actually sends a white flag, not to surrender, to discuss terms for burying the dead and caring for the wounded at that point. And so you do have this Confederate tactical victory at Valverde, but it's a Pyrrhic one, because Canby is still in possession of Fort Craig. The Confederates have reached the river, and part of what's driving their ferocious assault is thirst, is the desire to get to water, not unlike which we'll talk about in the next video. Major General Carleton at Apache Pass, when the California column of federal troops is essentially driven to charge down Apaches in the hills in order to reach water. So in this territory, you do have the desperation of lack of supply, of potential dealing with thirst and other depredations of driving these offensive actions. But having failed to capture Fort Craig, in the aftermath of Valverde, the Confederates have obviously taken casualties, and they can't afford to do that. They have to turn north and move into Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and other territories in search of supplies. Not just conquest, but supply. Because another aspect of this situation is that Baylor, who we discussed earlier, and his second Texas Mounted Rifles have been living in Mesilla for some time at this point, and in addition to setting up a Confederate government there, they've been eating all the food and using all the supplies, and Sibley cannot simply stay there. He has to move on, occupy cities and towns and forts if he can and try to survive and support an army in the field. Canby very cunningly sends out his regular cavalry and other scouts ahead of Sibley and successfully beats him to some of these points. And you have Federal cavalry essentially burning stores with varying degrees of success, sometimes just being able to start setting them on fire before the rebels arrive, or in some cases, as in Santa Fe and some other areas, essentially botching this effort. And so there's that aspect to the campaign as well in terms of what's driving the armies forward. Now, as a wargaming subject, I think the campaign in Arizona and this territory is very interesting. The troop types are very interesting. You have this three-layered war and conflict involving not just the North and South, but the native people, as Megan Nelson discusses, the various Apache faction from the Mescaleros to the Chiricahua under Cochise and Mangas Coloradas, and you do have this stunning scenery that you could bring to to the tabletop, and make your scenarios interesting. Incorporate the need to seize supplies and the need to seize wagon trains and other storage sites for food into your games. I think there's a lot of um, food for thought here. I think there are a lot of opportunities to make gaming this aspect of the Civil War interesting, even if you're not doing a set piece battle like Valverde, but doing a scenario based on a portion of it, a scouting action, a sabotage action, an attempt to um, rustle horses or um, stampede cattle and other animals that the armies in the field rely upon to survive and maneuver. I think there's a lot to do here and a lot to talk about. And in our next episode, we'll look at some terrain options and other figures that can be used, and also review the other books dealing mainly with the Civil War in the American Indian Territories, the Battle of Glorieta Pass, so what happens after Valverde, and we'll also talk about the conflicts with the Apache at Apache Pass between Colonel, later Brigadier General Carleton, and the Apache under Mangas Coloradas and Cochise and Geronimo, allegedly as well, and discuss all of these interesting aspects of the American Civil War out west. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and stay tuned for part two. As discussed, I'll also leave a few links to some of the resources that I've referenced in this episode, including some of the national parks in Arizona, as well as a link to the Raven Banner Games website, where you could purchase any of their great figures, from the Texas Lancers to the Confederate Sharpshooters and any of the great Union troops that they make as part of this range. So I hope to bring you some great content in the future. As always, thanks for listening, everyone. Keep rolling dice and painting miniatures and having fun with your hobby, and have a great week, everybody.